I want to explain to you how you can choose strings for your guitar. Okay, there are tons and tons of different guitar strings out there. But what you generally want to do is you want to start out by reading the instructions that came with your guitar, because different manufacturers have different specifications for the type of strings that you can use. I'm going to give you some general guidelines, but you need to start there. Another great resource for information is your local guitar store or your local music store. And you might live in a location where you don't necessarily have a music store, so generally the internet is a great source for finding different types of strings and what works well for people. You can get on different guitar forums and talk to other guitar players about what they've used, because I have what I do, but there's a lot of other guitarists that can help you out and point you in the right direction. So I'll just give you kind of my opinion on it. You need to start out with your manual, and I'll give you an example. The manual with this particular manufacturer of guitar, which happens to be Martin, they tell you not to use, and I'm not quoting this from, I'm going off of memory here, I don't have anything in front of me, but I'm pretty sure that they will recommend you do not go heavier than a medium gauge string. So obviously you don't want to, especially with acoustic, this is extremely important, is you want to stick with whatever strings that your manufacturer tells you. But this is a medium gauge string. Just some general ideas: the heavier the gauge, the kind of heavier and bigger and fuller the sound. The lighter the gauge, the more thin the sound, and the lighter the sound. Okay, that just makes sense, right? Because if you play your top or your bottom E string, that's a lot bigger sound than the top string, right? Okay, so that just makes sense. The heavier the gauge the string, the bigger, the fuller the sound. The other thing to keep in mind with heavier strings is it's going to be more difficult to press down. So when you're first starting out, you might want to use a lighter gauge string because it's going to be easier for your fingers, and you're not going to build up blisters on your hand. You're going to play longer for a longer duration than if you have like heavier gauge strings. And also it has to do with your action, how hard it is for you to press the string down. Is it really easy? Well, that means you have a lower action and probably a lighter string. The higher the action, the heavier string, the more difficult it is to press down. A classic example, if you want to go to the opposite end of the spectrum, if you've ever seen a slide guitar or a resonator or a dobro, the action on them are like this tall, a half an inch, because generally you don't do much fretting on a dobro. And they have really, really heavy, big strings because you're using a bottleneck slide on them. Okay, so that's kind of the opposite end of the spectrum. So you want to use medium gauge strings. I would suggest, if you're just starting out, you want to go for a lighter gauge string. But you definitely do not want to put a heavy gauge string, anything heavier than what the manufacturer will warranty for your acoustic guitar, because you can literally pull your guitar apart. Okay, because this framing in here is under a lot of stress anyway. Okay, and this, the strings are pulling on this soundboard and the bracing on here, and the heavier the gauge of the string, when you bring it up to pitch, the more tension there is on the string, and therefore you can actually pull your guitar apart if you use too heavy a gauge of strings on your acoustic. For your electric guitar, generally I like to use, if you're just starting out, I would recommend you use 9s. Okay, and that's basically what they're, that's just the number 9, and that's how they gauge the strings here, like 9s, 10s, 11s, or 12s. And what that refers to is the actual the width, the diameter, I think it is, of the string itself. But if you go to any music store or you go online, you can look for strings that are 9s or 10s or 11s or 12s. I would start out with 9s. You could even go light as 8s, but they tend to break pretty easily, especially when you're not really proficient with your pick just yet. But they're very easy to push down. 9s are going to give you a little bit more sound, and they're not going to break quite as much, and they're going to be easier for you to push down. I generally stick with 10s on my electric guitar, simply because I play a lot of blues. And when you get to 11s and maybe even 12s, that's really, you're talking about jazz, and kind of like some big heavy strings to make those big, like 13th chords and stuff. You'll go with heavier gauge strings when you're not going to be doing a lot of string bends. But 9s or 10s for electric, and with your acoustic, you want to go for a light to medium gauge. One word of warning: I don't even know if they still make these strings or not, but years ago when I was first starting out, they made some strings that had heavy bottoms, light tops. I read about a guitarist who tried that, and what happened was it kind of pulled his neck out of whack. Okay, kind of twisted the neck. Not dramatically, but you just have to keep in mind that when you're talking about setting up your guitar, which is really what you're doing, talking about strings, you need to follow the manufacturer's suggestions, because they're the folks that actually put this whole thing together, and the engineers are the ones that said, okay, we can have this gauge string on here without doing any kind of damage to the guitar. So you need to follow whatever manufacturer suggestions. And if you bought a guitar like from a pawn shop or something, or it was a hand-me-down guitar and you don't have that anymore, go online, type in the model number of that guitar, and try to dig up that information. You can always call your music store, but generally I think you're pretty safe if you're playing electric to stick with 9s or 10s, and when you're doing acoustic, a light to a medium gauge.